Hello and welcome to the Climate Resilience Podcast, brought to you by JBA Consulting. I'm Phil Emonson, and in this podcast series, we unpick some of the complexities, challenges, and opportunities on the topic of climate resilience with some inspirational thought leaders. Whether you're working on local adaptation projects, planning for climate risk, or simply looking for hope backed by science, you're in the right place. If you enjoy these conversations, be sure to follow the podcast and subscribe wherever you listen. Share with your friends and colleagues too. Anyone interested in building a more resilient future. Now, let's jump into today's episode. My guest today is David Porter, President of the Institution of Civil Engineers and Director of Engineering at the Department for Infrastructure in Northern Ireland. His career has included the delivery of major transport schemes, the impacts of climate change, and national infrastructure strategy. And David has long championed for better communication between engineers and the public. We'll touch on this and so much more today in what I'm sure will be a really super conversation. So, David, welcome to the podcast. It's great to have you. And perhaps you could start by introducing yourself.
Yeah, so as you say, I'm David Porter, and it's my great honour to be the 161st President of the Institution of Civil Engineers. And that's a huge role that I take up, but it also means an awful lot to me because you'll hear from my accent that I'm from Northern Ireland, and I'm the third president in our 208-year history from Northern Ireland. So it is really quite something. It's a huge honour. In my day job, I'm currently the Chief Highway Engineer for Northern Ireland. And I've been involved in government in Northern Ireland or in the civil service in Northern Ireland over the last 27 years, initially in the road sector, then spent about 10 years in flood risk management, and then back into the highway sector now.
Well, look, as I say, it's super to have you. It's a real honour to have you, and may I congratulate you on your presidency, which I think started in the autumn. We've got a lot to touch on in the episode today. In the opening, I touched on communication, and I think that's where I'd like to start. Communication, I know, is at the heart of one of your presidential themes, which is communicating better the value of infrastructure. So tell me a little bit more about this. Why did you choose it, for example, as one of your themes?
Well, throughout my career, I've recognised the real value of communicating the function of infrastructure, and also explaining to people what happens whenever it breaks down, and particularly thinking of flood risk, where flood events happen, and going out to communities and explaining the function, the limitations, and also what they can expect in terms of a standard of protection. So whenever I was thinking about my presidential themes, I knew that I wanted to do something about communication, and so that issue of communicating the value of infrastructure, and also in particular communicating to a non-technical audience. So I think as engineers, we're very good at talking to each other, and we're also highly skilled at talking engineer to other professionals. But we all use a certain language, we use acronyms, we talk in a certain way, and we also have a technical understanding. And what we need to keep in our minds as engineers and professionals that work in this space is that language may not necessarily be understood by members of the public or by community groups or by other people that don't have that technical understanding. And actually, if we can understand that, if we can change our language, if we can speak in a way that they understand, they will better get the function of infrastructure, the importance of infrastructure, and then the key purpose of infrastructure, which is really to help people and the planet to thrive.
Yeah, and that's so interesting. We're only a few minutes in, and probably without knowing it, you've touched on one of a number of recurring themes that we've had throughout the 24, 25 episodes now of the podcast, which is the importance of language and communicating effectively to build awareness. And awareness is the start of how we build resilient societies and resilient communities, isn't it? If communities have that awareness of the risks around them and what infrastructure and assets are doing for them and the role they play, then they're going to be much more able to adapt and respond and recover to any stresses that may come down the line. So I can understand entirely from what you're saying there why you chose communication as one of your themes. Are there any particular examples from your work in transport or flood risk management you've mentioned as well, where actually getting out and talking to that non-technical audience was really apparent.
Yeah. So a couple of examples that really spring to mind. One is often on a radio where you're trying to explain why a road is being closed, and we can be really good engineers and maybe explain the size of the machines or the depth of the hole or that. But actually, what we need to really do is put it in a language that they understand. So in one particular case, I described the depth of the hole by comparing it to my height and saying that it was 3 times the depth of my height. And straight away, a non-technical person could understand the height of an average man and could work out what 3 times that depth. And they could then understand, that's a big, deep hole. I now understand why the road can't meander its way around a hole of that depth. So finding ways of actually putting it, telling the story and putting it in their language. The other very clear example I have is how we can better use different tools and different ways of communicating. And this is a flood risk example. So for years, the old Rivers Agency had a flood map showing that the centre of Belfast was at flood risk. And we had a map with a big blue area shaded in, and that showed the area that was at significant flood risk. Yeah. And nobody really paid much attention to it. And as software developed and we got into the more sophisticated software packages, the team in our mapping modeling team came to me and said, actually, as part of this new package, we can now produce animations. And I says, oh, that sounds interesting. Would you show me that? And they were able to show how Belfast floods, how the flood develops, how it meanders down different roads, and how it develops over time, and how that big blue area that was shown on the static map, how that increased in size over time. And it was a very, very different way of explaining the same sort of information, but described and shown in a very different way. And whenever we put that out, boy, did we get a reaction. You know, the resilient planner or the emergency planners and the resilience community, actually this communicated the same information, but in a different way and in a more meaningful way. And they were able then to better see and better understand what they needed to do in order to be prepared for that event if it ever happened.
Yeah, and as you say, it will show impacts at different times of within the event rather than a static map, which is fine. Has got a lot of value, and we rely on them, for sorts of planning purposes. But actually, to understand the impact at different points and geographies at different points in the event is really important. And in fact, and you might not have known this, but I worked on the hydrology for the Belfast study for JBA many years ago. So. Yeah, I remember doing a lot of that work for Carrickfergus and all those other parts of Belfast. Yeah,
and I was always impressed. You could see how the software that you were developing in order to produce that was getting more sophisticated and over time. You were getting, we were given more features, and that was really adding to that picture and adding to our certainty around the information that we were getting out of it, but also adding to the way that we could actually use that to other people, not maybe those not familiar with flood maps and flood modelling.
And it's really interesting actually because for sort of technical teams, at JBA, but many other consultants as well. Actually, sometimes it is about delivering the hydrology, delivering the modelling, delivering the flood maps. But actually, there's a lot of value that comes downstream from that in terms of how those maps are then used to improve resilience out there in the community in terms of that understanding and that awareness. And I think sometimes we perhaps forget that the role that we play as consultants in developing those technologies to then improve that resilience, which is as you say, is so important.
I think that's an important point, just in terms of so whenever we're trying to communicate better with non-technical people, it's not that we're trying to dumb down the engineering or the hydraulics or the hydrology. We need that. We need to have that in-depth understanding, but it's finding a way to actually communicate that in a way that they actually get, that they understand the hazard, they understand the consequence. That's what we really need to work at.
We were having a little chat about this podcast the other day, and you mentioned a phrase which was that if I've got this right, infrastructure provides a service. It's a service. People get what they want to get from it. So if you think about a road, people they don't see it necessarily as an asset, as an infrastructure. They see it as a way to get from A to B.
Yeah.
So they can go about their daily business. They can get to work on time or whatever it is. Expand on that a little bit more, if you will. And I suppose the key question here, though, is, with all of the stresses and the pressures that are on infrastructure and our assets, not just the pressures from climate change, do we need to change that view a little bit? Does that need to change? Yeah.
So often people talk about trying to get across the value of infrastructure. And sometimes whenever we hear that as engineers, we think, right, they need to be told about the strength of the concrete that'll impress them, or the amount of reinforcement that we've put in, or the complexity of the design process. And actually, the users of infrastructure don't want to hear that. What they want to understand is, will this give me a reliable journey time so that I can get access to what's at the other end, so that I can go and meet my loved one, or so that I can have a reliable journey to my workplace, or so that I can go to the hospital to get the treatment that's going to keep me alive, or so that I can go to the airport so that I can go on a holiday with my family. It's that service that infrastructure provides that we really need to be focused in on to really explain the value of it. And that's particularly true in developed countries where there's infrastructure everywhere. And sometimes people say, we've just announced this new piece of railway, or this new road, or this new water pumping station. Nobody seems to care. Well, it's because infrastructure is everywhere in developed countries, and going out and telling them we're adding a tiny, tiny little bit more to that infrastructure doesn't really excite them, in the way that if you think back 200 years ago, whenever there was no trains, and in the northeast of England, we had the first passengers travelling by train, crowds came out and watched that, because this was a spectacle, the likes of which they'd never seen before. So we're operating in a different phase. We're operating in a very mature infrastructure system, and therefore we need to really understand it's the service that infrastructure offers that is really what we need to emphasize, how people rely on it every single day. The road network, either directly or indirectly, the transport networks, the public water supply, flood defences, those are things that people rely on each and every day, but it's the service that they provide that they really are interested in. And it really came clearly to me. I was coming back from the awards ceremony IC awards ceremony in Wales, and I had to travel on a train from Cardiff to the airport in Bristol, about half-hour journey. And I was, being an engineer, looking outside to see how those that had planned it had used the topography of the ground so that they could have the best route possible, and how they had to cut through certain places in order to keep that nice and straight, and how they had recognise that they had to bridge over some waterways, and also then connect roads and level crossings. And I looked around the carriage and realised that I was the only one that was actually looking out at those types of features. Everybody else, they were either consumed by what was happening on their phone, or they were discussing where they were going to eat whenever they got off at the other end, or they were setting up a meeting with in their company, or with some of their family. So it became abundantly clear, actually, people are using this service. It's the service that they want, and actually, the infrastructure itself, they're pretty blind to that. It's pretty invisible, because what they want is the service.
Yeah. And so to move that thought on then to its next logical point, when that service needs to be maintained. So you mentioned then there that in the UK we have a very mature infrastructure system, which we do, and there are of course times when we need to invest in new assets, and that brings with it growth opportunities, which perhaps we can come to in a minute. But for the moment, let's just focus on perhaps at times an aging infrastructure system. We do need to continue to maintain that, don't we? So that those consumers can still rely on it, be that road, rail, flood risk, etc. So this balance then of maintenance of existing, coupled with the need to focus on and invest in new projects. Touch on that a little bit, if you may.
Yeah. So the reality of our infrastructure systems is that they are very mature.
Mm.
However, we are putting more pressure on them, partly because of the changing climate, partly because of population growth, partly because the generations before us built infrastructure to a very, very good standard, and we have almost dined out on the fact that they were so well designed, but we have added more and more and more pressure onto them, way in excess of what they were ever designed to cope with or to carry. So it's a real tribute to those that went, the engineers that went before us in terms of our infrastructure systems. However, what is becoming abundantly clear is that we are getting ever closer to a tipping point in UK infrastructure in particular, where it is aging and it is declining. And if we don't recognise the value and importance of maintenance and renewals, we're going to get to a point where we're going to start to see the service that's delivered by infrastructure deteriorate, whether that be roads needing to be closed, speed restrictions on railways, bridges at the point of risk of collapse, or flood defences being overtopped, and that's something that we really need to hone in on. It was really drawn attention to in the ICE State of the Nation document last year. Also, the Royal Academy have produced a very good document on ageing infrastructure, and again, it was emphasised in the State of the Nation this year, where it is something that we really are pressing the decision makers and politicians to recognise the real value of maintenance and renewals. And actually, we're starting to see a shift in their thinking. The 10-year infrastructure strategy does talk in more detail and more places about renewals, maintenance and renewals than it had previously. So we're starting to see that shift starting to happen from building all new to recognising that we can still build some new, but actually we need to maintain the existing infrastructure.
Yeah. And so on that point there, I mean, you've mentioned a couple of things that I'd like to just expand on a little bit, if I may. You've mentioned the 10-year infrastructure strategy from the Labour government, which is obviously linked to the Labour sort of manifesto around growth.
Yeah.
In order to unlock benefit and potential in different parts of the country, and you've also there mentioned the ICE State of the Nation report, which I think in some ways is a reaction and a response to that strategy. So tell me a little bit more about the what and the why, if you can, then, of that State of the Nation report.
So State of the Nation is one of the flagship documents within ICA, and it's been going since 2002. It's evolved over time. And over the last couple of years, we've been focused in on three main areas, and that is transport, water, and energy. And this year we kept those three main headings, but we focused in on the delivery of the 10-year infrastructure strategy. And the main question that we were posing within the document and also at the launch event last week was, are we ready? Are we ready to deliver the ambitions set out in the 10-year infrastructure strategy? And the glib answer to that, or the quick answer to that, may well be yes, because engineers always can find a solution and the industry always steps up. But actually, we need to be self-reflective as well. And so and think about our capability and our capacity, think about our skills, availability, think about the resources that are available to us. We need to be also thinking about how we can encourage government to develop a long-term workforce strategy, how we can, as an industry, collaborate better so that client and consultant and contractors work together with a common purpose in order to make sure that infrastructure actually is delivered that meets the needs of society. And those were the questions that were posed within the State of the Nation.
Right. Yeah. Well, I mean, are we ready? Are we ready to deliver the ambition? It's a really interesting question. And I think what you've touched on there neatly moves us to the sort of next point, which is one I'd like to just spend a little bit longer exploring with you, which is let's look ahead, because whilst it's a 10-year infrastructure strategy, clearly there needs to be more horizon scanning beyond that 10 years. So if we were to look ahead, let's consider what the future of engineering looks like and how we can build a workforce with the right skills, capabilities, capacities to build a society that's resilient to the impacts of climate change and indeed other pressures. So what you mentioned their competencies and capacities and skills, what do they look like now across the sector? And then what do you think needs to happen to equip not just the next generation, but the generation after that, today's primary school children, with the skills that they will need? Because in 20 years' time, the environment that they enter the workplace in will be very different.
Yeah, indeed it will. So a couple of things that come to mind whenever you ask that. So the first one is a recognition about how our industry has changed and how it will continue to change. So if you go back in time, far enough back, civil engineering projects were delivered by civil engineers, and that's what made up the team. Whereas that's not actually the reality today. What we big projects and civil engineering projects and infrastructure projects are delivered by multidisciplinary teams. A whole range of professions and a whole range of others come together in order to deliver a project. And we're seeing that collaborative working is hugely important today. So that's a different way of working that we need to get our heads around, and we need to shape our industry. And in some ways, that gives us the opportunity to attract others to work in this space, which is one reason why ICE has introduced a second protected title. So rather than just being a chartered civil engineer or an incorporated civil engineer, you can now be recognised as a chartered infrastructure engineer or an incorporated infrastructure engineer or an engineering technician that works in that. And that's because we recognise that actually people are coming on their academic journey and from different routes, but are coming to them work in infrastructure. And so an infrastructure engineer, and we'll take the chartered engineer just as the example for ease rather than talking about the different grades, that will be somebody who may not necessarily have a civil engineering academic qualification, but they are an engineer. So they might have a mechanical engineering degree or electrical engineering degree or some other hybrid type degree. So previously, ICE wouldn't have been able to easily get them to be recognised as a professional. But with this new protected title, they can now come to ICE and we can get them a route of getting professionally recognised. And so that's broadening out the scope of people. It's given people recognition that are working in that space of infrastructure, that actually you can get professionally qualified. You can demonstrate your competence to yourself firstly, but actually what that really does, that chartered status or that incorporated status or engineering technician status actually does, is it gives assurance to others that you're a competent person to design and deliver and enhance our infrastructure. And that assurance to society and that assurance to others is hugely important. Looking forward then, we are in this space where AI is being quite disruptive, and we're not just quite sure how that is going to change our industry, but we know that change is coming. So we need to make sure that we are alive to those changes, that we recognise that this change is happening around us. And as a professional body, we need to be thinking about the ethical consequences of that. Who is responsible for design? How do we get sign off? How can we give that assurance that we were able to give historically by saying the people involved were professionally qualified, therefore their work, you can be assured, society, that their work is good. How can we still give that level of assurance in this new world where we have AI becoming more and more involved with our design and the decision-making process? So it's something that ICE and many other professional bodies are very alive to, thinking about the consequences of these new and emerging technologies in our space.
That's really interesting. And I suppose the final place I'd like to take this then is thinking about your presidential year, and what the rest of that year looks like for you, and what perhaps the biggest goal or ambition is for you as president of this highly regarded and well respected and historical institution. As you said at the top, it's a huge honor for you, I'm sure. What is that big ambition and goal for you for the rest of this presidential term?
Yeah. So I set out on my presidential term to engage with as many members and people as I possibly could. So for me, being ICE president, you get that opportunity to visit all the English regions, to visit all the regions across the UK, and also to go to some of our international regions as well. I've been in Hong Kong, and I'm programmed and planned to go to Australia and New Zealand and Portugal and some other places later in the year. But the real benefit of that was not necessarily to see the infrastructure there or to go on site visits, because I've spent my life on sites and a site in Northern Ireland is not dissimilar to a site that you'll see over here in England, and it's not dissimilar to a site that you'll see over in Hong Kong or in Australia. What I wanted to see whenever I go to any of the visits and the sites is actually the people that are involved, to encourage them to recognise the value of what they do, to understand the purpose and the real benefit that they bring to society, to understand the real benefit of continuing to push on in their professional development because of the recognition that gives them as an engineer, but also that assurance to that wider society. So for the rest of my presidency, I shall be looking for those opportunities where I can engage with people, talk with them, and encourage them to continue on their professional journey.
Well, here to that, and I hope it goes really well, and I wish you every success for the rest of your tenure. David, we've covered so much actually as we always do in such a short amount of time. We touched on language and communications at the start. We've spoken about infrastructure as a service. We spoke about unlocking potential and growth through the 10-year infrastructure strategy, and then we've spoken about people at the end, people that you're going to meet, the importance of CPD, skills and capacities and capabilities now and in the future. David, thanks for joining us. It's been a fantastic episode. So yeah, thank you for taking time out of your schedule to join us. So we've reached the end of our time today. If you've enjoyed the conversation, then please hit subscribe so you're ready for the next episode in a month's time. And if you'd like to show your support for the show, consider sharing it with others or leave us a short review wherever you're listening. It really helps more people to discover and enjoy the podcast. Thanks for joining us. I'm Phil Emonson, and you've been listening to the Climate Resilience Podcast, brought to you by JBA Consulting.